Welcome to the Am I Hunting podcast. On this episode, I'm joined by biologist Kristie Sitar as we talk about the factors limiting deer abundance in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. All right, welcome to the Am I Hunting podcast. Thank you again for joining. Now, again, this is a really good conversation with Kristie Sitar. Basically, I was kind of looking into kind of the deer numbers in the UP, especially with the conversation around the wolf population. Basically, it looks like the population up in the UP is essentially stabilized. They have tracked that the wolf population is kind of basically started to spread out throughout the whole UP kind of evenly. So I was curious to see kind of what the deer population is looking like in regards to that. And I came across this report that Kristie had, co-written with another biologist, and it basically went into a lot of the factors that are affecting essentially buck harvest. Now, again, when I went into reading this report, I kind of had a misconstrued, look at, this was going to be an estimate of overall deer population. It does it in a way, but it's just looking at buck harvest, especially in regards to these different factors that are spelled out in the report here. So, and as Kristie will explain, it does go into a little bit about the correlation between the buck harvest and the general, assumption of what the deer population looks like for the UP, and the relationship between that. And it breaks down basically the main factors, and that's really between the habitat, the condition of deer in winter, and how winter's affecting them, and then also on predation, and basically breaking down those different factors, and kind of how they kind of piece everything together, and their relationship as to that affecting buck harvest throughout the Upper Peninsula. So let's not hold up the conversation any longer. So let's get into that discussion with Kristie. Let you go ahead and introduce yourself and what you do with the DNR.
Sure. So my name is Kristie Sitar. I am the wildlife biologist here in the Newberry Forest Management Unit in the Eastern Upper Peninsula. And I just passed my 25 years working for the state of Michigan. And I think 20 or 21 of that is with the DNR. The first few were with what was DEQ back then. So.
Okay. And then have you been primarily up in the UP then doing most of your work, or have you been across the state?
All in the UP except for the first year. I was a biologist down in Jackson County for a year when I first started. And then I've been up in the UP ever since then. I'm not from Michigan originally, but I did go to grad school at Michigan State, as you can see by the t-shirt.
Yep. Yeah. Okay. So so I wanted to reach out to you, like we had discussed, through email and prior to starting the recording, that I stumbled upon a report that you were part author of, and it's about the deer numbers up in the UP. And I know that there's a trend of where the deer numbers are low, and actually it appears to be that they're declining still. And I know there's a big group of the population that's concerned about it, and I know the wolf population then gets into the discussion as well. And you, in this report, you dive into it seems like all the big factors are playing into those deer numbers, and I just wanted to talk to you about it and dive into a little bit about what the report said.
Yep, I'd be happy to talk to you about it. I've given a few talks about it in the last couple of years as well.
Excellent.
And that information is it's the same information, but I've been able to touch on it a bit more in a presentation than in the paper. So.
Oh, excellent. Okay. And then since the report came out, has some of the data changed significantly, or is it still pretty consistent with what the report indicates?
Yeah, so the data that this report is based on is a lot of it is from the Michigan Predator Prey research study. So that was completed. So there's not been new data sources. Of course, winter is still marching on. So there's more winter data since the report concluded, as well as more buck harvest data. But no more new data other than those sources. I mean, there's always, of course, one of the things that's in this paper is a little bit of a look at hemlock harvest or hemlock decline over, since pre-settlement times, and changing aspen harvest. That stuff is still, of course, that is still occurring in Michigan as well, but it's not something that we've gone back and looked at, and we also don't really expect much of a change in those areas either. But so the long and the short of it is, I guess I'll just say, yeah, every year that we exist, more deer are harvested and winter still continues, but no other new data as far as the sources of predation and that sort of thing.
Gotcha. Okay. And then, so, basically it looks like the report kind of starts out with, talking about how the estimates are calculated by the number of buck harvests. Can you explain how, that buck harvest translates into calculating what the deer population looks like?
Yeah, so I'll try to be real brief on things, just so we can get through everything you want. And if you want more of an explanation, I'll let you ask follow-up questions. But
okay.
Yeah, so we don't have estimates of deer population size, right? And we're probably not ever going to. And so so we looked at a couple different things. We looked at buck harvest, and we also looked at hunter effort, because there are some biases with buck harvest, right? Obviously, buck harvest is going to be impacted by the number of hunters that you have, and could be impacted by declining hunter numbers and changes in buck regulations that would happen over that same time period. Can be influenced by the weather during firearm season. The buck harvest that we use in this report, though, is all seasons combined. But if you have wicked, most of the deer harvest occurs during firearm season. And so if you had wicked awful weather during firearm season, you might expect that to decline also, as well as maybe even the day that the opener falls, right? If the opener falls on a Tuesday, we usually have lower participation than if it falls on a Thursday, Friday, or Saturday, right? So those things can impact buck harvest, and a few less of those impact hunter effort if you looked at hunter effort, but we didn't have a big data source for hunter effort. We haven't collected that for the last 40 years. And so we did end up going with buck harvest. So one of the ways we could check that and see if we felt like it was an accurate representation of the population was in Crystal Falls, which is the mid snowfall zone. That was where the predator prey did their mid snowfall zone work. They had they had all kinds of cameras out, and they were calculating deer abundance through those camera surveys. And so I think it was an 8 or 10 year period where we had deer abundance in the Crystal Falls area. And then we overlaid it with buck harvest just to see how good it was going to track or not. And it actually tracks really, really well. So that made us feel pretty comfortable with using buck harvest, even though it's not a perfect measure. Again, like I said, we're not going to have deer abundance for the whole UP. So we felt pretty comfortable using it after seeing how well it really tracked with deer abundance in that Crystal Falls and then snowfall zone area.
Okay. So you're kind of looking at then if the buck harvest is high and I guess maybe the hunter effort was low, like if those two coincide, then you can estimate that the bucks or the deer population is up then? Is that how it's kind of tracked or calculated a bit?
That would be a standard thought, right? That if your buck harvest was high and your effort was low, that your population was increasing. But we ended up not even using hunter effort because, again, like I said, we just didn't have a good enough data set for it.
Gotcha. So. Okay. All right. And then the other thing I saw is that in part of the report, it was showing kind of what the buck harvest, kind of what the graph looked like, and then how the regs had changed.
Yep.
Kind of going down the timeline with that. Now, is the regs trying to promote higher buck harvest or trying to help the population out in any way? Is there a cause and effect with the or the harvest and the regs, how they determined when they were going to start doing that up in the UP there?
Well, so what I would say is that it's not so much a cause and effect, right? But and the reason for different regulation changes is not necessarily related to, oh, we want to increase the population of deer, so we're going to change this reg that affects buck harvest, right? So the regs that affect buck harvest are generally less related to having a population level impact and more related to the type of opportunity that's out there for hunters.
Gotcha.
And so,
Okay.
and so that's changed from the 90s all the way through to where we are today. It used to be in the UP, you could take any 2 bucks in any seasons with no restrictions, right? And so that, of course, is really different from the combo tag that exists today for buck harvest.
Yep.
So those buck, the reason we put the regulation changes in the document was so we didn't want it to look like we were ignoring the fact that regulation changes have occurred during this window also.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yep. So we just kind of wanted to put that out there front and center to show that, yep, there have been regulation changes, and they do coincidentally coincide with a reduction in buck harvest as well. But
yep. Yeah. When looking at the graph, I'm like, okay, is it just following the same timeline, or does it have something to do with those figures that came out? So thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah, more like it's following the same timeline, especially because we can still, and we keep going back to that Crystal Falls population, right? We had population numbers and we overlaid buck harvest even when regulation changes were happening, and it still tracks, buck harvest still tracks well as a measure, as a measure of index of the population. Doesn't mean it's the population size itself, but.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So then you already touched base on talking about the hemlock and the aspen, and how that landscape has changed. So I guess let's talk about why we're seeing that trend where there's less aspen, or not less aspen, less of the hemlock, and why that's important. And then in regards to the aspen harvest, why that is so important as well.
Yep. So hemlock and cedar are critical species that help deer overwinter. They're critical shelter or critical cover. Sometimes we say shelter, sometimes we say cover, but they provide a different environment for deer that overwinter in the Upper Peninsula. And in the Upper Peninsula, of course, we get a fair bit of snow over most of the Upper Peninsula. And so deer have evolved to travel to, in most places in the UP, to travel to deer yards in winter, also called deer wintering complexes. The old language is deer yards, and it's really easy to keep using that old language because we've used it for decades. But so deer will travel from these high snowfall areas down generally to southern or central or southern parts of the UP where there's less snow. And those deer yards or deer wintering complexes tend to have more cedar and hemlock. And that cedar and hemlock, they actually reduce there's less snow underneath cedar and hemlock in a deer yard in winter, especially when you have nice densely packed stands. So there's less snow under there, and it's actually a few degrees warmer. And both of those things are things that help deer survive the winter. If there's less snow, you're spending less energy walking around. If it's a little bit warmer, you're spending less energy keeping warm. So cedar and hemlock are both very, very important to deer. I would say critical for deer overwintering in the Upper Peninsula. And the hemlock decline, since pre-settlement days in the Upper Peninsula has been substantial. It's about a 97, I think, is the number percent decline since pre-settlement times, and that's unfortunate. It's these days hemlock and cedar that occur in deer yards are definitely protected species. They're not going to get harvested unless there's been an agreement with both divisions, Wildlife Division and Forestry Division, to make that happen, because those species are so critical. The reason I don't go into any information or any detail in cedar in this report is because cedar is oftentimes, in addition to there being cedar stands, cedar is oftentimes a component of other stands, and so it's a lot harder to track to track cedar, because if you just looked up cedar stands, it wouldn't necessarily get at any overall reduction in cedar across the landscape that way. So that's why cedar's not in there. As far as aspen goes, we used aspen in this report as a measure of summer browse for species, right? So there are lots of other things that deer browse in summer also, but this aspen was just looked at as what trends have occurred in summer browse for deer as well. And so there has been this reduction in aspen over the years. And, there were big pulses in the late 90s and that aspen harvest. And so the reason aspen is a browse species, of course, is because when aspen is harvested, it puts out lots of little shoots, and those shoots are really great deer browse, right? So, and they are only browsed until they grow beyond the reach of deer. And then, of course, they continue to grow into a mature stand again. And the reason that part of that decline has occurred is because once a bunch of aspen is harvested and then it regrows, it's another 40 years before that aspen can be harvested again and become a really great deer browse again, right? So the aspen information in the report isn't meant to signify that there's poor summer deer browse everywhere. Is just meant to indicate that there are other things going on, one of which is the fact that there's less aspen browse out there on the landscape because of this big pulse in the 90s. It's just not ready to harvest again. Doesn't mean there's no aspen harvest, because of course there is, and it also doesn't mean there's no deer browse, because there are still other sources of deer browse as well. But it's an important thing to consider, at least.
Gotcha. Okay. I did want to go back to the hemlock and cedar. With that decline, is it just because of like harvest of those trees, and they're just not very good at regenerating or coming back?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yep. So when those species are harvested, they will regenerate, right? They'll grow again from seed in the seed bank, or they'll put up shoots. And so, yeah, those trees regrow, but they are preferred browse species by deer in winter also. So if deer can reach them, they're going to eat them. And so when they can reach all those young cedar or hemlock that are, even if they grow to just above the snow, well, then deer can reach them. They're going to eat them and continually browse them. And as a result, they don't reach the canopy and replace themselves and become a mature tree in the stand again. Yep.
Gotcha. Important so point. They just can't handle that browse to be able to, I guess, reestablish themselves then before they're
slow enough growing, right? Aspen grows quickly and can be browsed by deer, and in a few years it's going to be way above deer height. Right. But cedar and hemlock are much slower growing and really just can't get above deer if they're constantly browsed like that every year.
So looking at those two things, then that that could be just an indicator of their food source during the summer, and then for the winter especially, because that's the when they're burning up all those fat reserves and whatnot, that's the critical time for them. So
yep, winter is definitely critical, and that's when those species get browsed. That's when cedar and hemlock are preferred browses, just during winter.
Gotcha. Yep. Okay. All right. And then you also touch base on of course, one of the biggest things that affect the deer population, especially in the UP, is during wintertime and the winter weather. And I found it quite interesting that, in the report, it showed that there's a growing trend of increased snow that's accumulating more or less up in the UP. And, that trend, I know that it looked like it did some kind of, gaining and waxing within the data. Is this like a growing trend, just that you may see those snow levels drop back down again below that like critical line that you talked about? Or is this something that looks like it could be trending upward where, snowfall could be higher just an average up in the UP going forward?
Yeah, so I think it's, I don't think it's necessarily, it's not necessarily a trend that is, it certainly isn't a trend that looks like it would be driven by climate change, because it appears to be the opposite trend, right? So really
Right.
what we're talking about is when we have more than 90 days of winter with greater than a foot of snow on the ground, greater than 12 inches. When we have more than 90 days, it's a severe winter. And so kind of what you're referencing then is that if you look back at the 80s and early 90s up until the mid 90s, there were very, very few severe winters in the UP. And since the mid 90s to 2020 is when we kind of stopped for this data set for this paper. We had an incredible number more. I think it was 60 some percent more, and I'm not looking at the number on the document, but a vastly larger number of, here we go, a vastly higher number of severe winters since 96 than prior to 96. So when you hear people say, oh man, there were so many more deer in the late 80s, and this is what it's partly due to, of course, is the fact that we've, back up until that period, there were just 2 severe winters, and since then we have had 3 different times we have had consecutive winters. I guess we've had two consecutive periods of 3 severe winters in a row and 2 of back-to-back severe winters in a row, and only one time since I have worked here have we had 3 mild winters in a row. So those back-to-back severe winters, you might get a little break in there, and then we have a light winter. But one light winter isn't enough to combat all those losses, and so that's where the winter weather really comes in. And if you put buck harvest, if you plot buck harvest on top of that winter severity trend, it's amazing how perfect that fit is, right? So after severe winters, if you have a severe winter this year, it's next year's buck harvest that shows a decline because your deer population has declined, right? So it's you get that 1 year lag, and it's a perfect fit.
Yeah, it was amazing looking at the graph, which again, I will I'll probably link it in with the show so people can look at those graphs and everything like that. But yeah, it's almost a perfect lineup of those buck harvests and then lining up with those severe winters, like you said, that 1 year lag, kind of representing that next year. But yeah.
Yeah, so you have 3 severe winters, and then your deer population and your buck harvest declines for the next 3 years. And when you have mild winters, your buck harvest increases.
Yeah. Yep.
Yep.
Yeah. So I guess when you're looking at like a winter kill for deer and whatnot, what type of what percentage of the population are you considering, or is it when you kind of look at it, was it a hard winter? Are you able to give an estimate about how it would affect the general population of deer, or is that something that's not really tracked all that well?
It's not tracked terribly well, but we have, we've seen some numbers in the past that are kind of our gut check of where we think things are. So in a severe winter, we could lose 100,000 deer in the Upper Peninsula. In a moderate winter, that number falls off drastically. And in a mild winter, it's a whole lot lower, right? And a lot of those deer that die in severe winters are fawns. They're really the first ones to die.
Sure.
Because they go into winter, of course, with less body fat than other deer because they've been growing their body all summer, not putting fat on, but getting a bigger body, growing from a newborn fawn to a deer that's still, of course, a fawn going into winter and a smaller body. So those smaller bodied deer have a larger surface area to body weight ratio, which makes them lose heat faster. And so they're spending more energy keeping warm because they lose heat faster. They don't have fat reserves because they grew a body all summer and didn't put on a bunch of fat like adult deer would have. And so they go into winter just in poorer shape overall and less equipped to be able to handle it. So your fawns are really the first one to die in winter. And that has a really big impact, of course, because your fawns are what cause your population to increase the following year, right? If you have X
Right.
number of bucks and does going into winter and a really similar number coming out of winter, what increases your population is fawns added to that population. And so if your fawns from that were born if your deer that go into winter as fawns largely all die because winter was severe, then you don't have those additions next year, right?
Right.
In addition to that, your does that struggle through winter and are in very poor condition during winter, when they're and of course that's when they're carrying a fetus. So when spring happens for that doe, and if she's still alive and she's just in awful shape, is she may reabsorb that fetus, she may abort that fetus, or she may give birth to that fetus, that fawn, at that point, but not have body resources to produce any quality milk, and it still might die, right? So it affects the population in a couple different ways, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd seen reports before of, where, yeah, if a doe is in such bad condition that she'll either abort the fetus or, stop production of that fetus,
Yep.
just, as a defense mechanism, just to save her own life. So, yeah, it's
Yep.
amazing how, how they, do those types of things just so they can try to survive that. So then for the, deer in the winter isn't it usually like towards the end of winter, that's usually the kind of the critical moment for deer if we have like a really hard spring or like a later, heavy snowfall or something like that, or late winter, early spring, heavy storms, that's more critical than if we have a harder winter early on.
Yep, definitely. One of the most important factors is when spring arrives, essentially when winter stops, right? So if you think about it this way, when deer go into winter, they've got maximum fat reserves, right? And they're going to spend those in winter because number one, they eat less, their metabolism slows down, but they eat less. They've migrated to areas where they can spend less energy because it's a little warmer, and there's a little more cover and that sort of thing, a little less snow. So they've done all kinds of things to help themselves out, but and food is reduced, right? Because we've got more than a foot of snow on the ground, or even when we have snow on the ground, it's harder for them to access food, right? There's less food available, and what is available tends to be woody and therefore less nutritious. So deer can sustain that a lot easier when they have really high fat reserves, right? And when their fat reserves are lower as they go through the winter, their fat reserves decline. And as they get later and later in winter, they have less and less fat. And if winter really drags on and spring is really delayed showing up, there's this period of time where they've got no fat reserves left. And deer can only hang on for so long in that position, right? They have evolved to survive through winter like this, but they can only do it for so long. So absolutely, the arrival of spring is more important than anything.
Okay. So in regards to that actual time frame, are we looking at usually more like in February, or like is March time still just as critical for them, or even into April maybe, or just depends on what
I've
the
lived
weather
here
does?
well over 20 years. I've never seen winter end in February here ever. I think the earliest I've ever seen is mid-March, and that's considered early here, right? And
Okay.
that's still a long period of time. So it's not uncommon for us to still have more than a foot of snow on the ground at the end of March, right? So anytime it does, of course, it does depend when that starts, right? And to achieve that 90 days, right? So if we didn't have more than a foot of snow on the ground until mid-January, and we're talking about mid to late March, that's a shorter window of time, right? But deer
Gotcha.
they're still not putting fat on their body, from October to mid-January, right? So yeah, the earlier it arrives, the better, regardless really of when it starts. But and then it does play into it a little bit, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Then
So
typically,
anytime we still have real winter going on in April is definitely a problem.
okay. So I guess up where you're at then, when does you typically start to see the spring green up happen? Because I know at that point, then that's kind of they've kind of made it at that point once that green starts regenerating and they can really start put on the feedback again.
Yeah, so it's really variable, right? I would say, I mean, sometimes it happens really quickly. This has been a really odd winter. We've had pulses of snow and then some melt offs, but we still haven't melted below a foot of snow. Although some of the southern areas are probably a little less than a foot of snow right now. And as the sun gets stronger, it'll melt the snow on the north side of an east-west road. And so you see deer out there feeding, right? They're
Yep.
trying to get some resources that way.
Yep.
Boy, when does it usually happen up here? I would say, I mean, if I don't have an average date to give you, but if I had to guess, I would say it is usually early April here.
Okay.
There are some years definitely where it's a little bit earlier, but any time from mid-March on, we would be psyched to see it go. We would feel like that would be a little bit better situation for deer.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. And then the next thing that kind of the report talks about on the where I guess the effect on the buck harvest is to talk about the role of predators in deer mortality. And you kind of already touched base, but the report kind of dives into the mortality or the predation of fawn in regards to the different predators that are involved. So, and you kind of talk about kind of that's kind of the four big ones: bears, coyotes, bobcat, and wolves. And then you break down, in that report of kind of their percentages of how they affect those fawn numbers. So if you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, so you're right. Those are the four major predators in the UP on fawns: black bears, coyotes, bobcats, and wolves. And they exist in different numbers, right? So bears and coyotes are far more numerous. And so this information was looked at the low, medium, and high snowfall zone. So we looked at these predator densities on all three of those snowfall zones. So, and in all three of those snowfall zones, bears and coyotes were far, far more numerous than bobcats and wolves. Bobcats and wolves tend to be pretty a lot closer to each other and a lot lower than the number of bears and coyotes and the density of bears and coyotes. And actually bobcats are higher than wolves in all of the snowfall zones other than the high snowfall zone. In the high snowfall zone, there are more wolves than bobcats, but that's just to kind of give you an idea of where they fall. So in addition to predator densities, you also want to look at how efficient they are at killing fawns, right? Because first we were just looking at fawn mortality. So when you're looking at how efficient they are at killing fawns, bears and coyotes don't have the highest kill rates. There are lots and lots of bears and coyotes, but they each kill fewer fawns than a bobcat does or a wolf does. The problem, or not the problem, but the way the math works out though, because there are so many more bears and coyotes, their effect on the population, the fawn population and fawn mortality, I should say, is a lot higher. They're just because of their sheer numbers, it's a lot higher. The most efficient killer of fawns are actually bobcats. But bobcats kill on average 6.5 fawns a year per bobcat. And obviously you can't kill a half a fawn, right? But this is looking at averages, and so that's why that number is in there, right?
Right.
Because not every bobcat's going to kill exactly the same number of fawns either, right? So it's an average. But so just because of the sheer, even though bobcats are far more efficient killers than coyotes or bears, coyotes and bears have a much larger effect on the population, a much larger impact on the fawn population because they're so much more numerous.
Yeah, because I think even the graph showed, I think that you already said that the bobcat was 6.5. I think wolf was somewhere around 5 fawns, and then I think
about 5.5. Yep.
and I think the coyote and bear were both at about a 1.5 or something like
Yep.
somewhere around in there. But yeah,
Yep.
and if you look at the graph, I mean, they're what, even though they're 5 times less as efficient of killers, they kill or, I mean, I don't even know. I couldn't really, looking at the graph, you can't really see how many more times they've,
Yeah. So
the
I can
higher that
give you
graph
those.
they kill.
I'll give you those numbers real quick. These are approximate numbers because I'm just reading the scale on the graph. Coyotes,
Sure.
there are about 60 coyotes in 100 square miles, and I would say 67, 68 bears per 100 square miles. And you're talking about 10 bobcats per square mile and probably 6 wolves per square mile. So really big difference, right?
Yep.
67 and 60 coyotes and bears per square mile and 6 wolves per square mile. It's a massive difference, right?
Yep. Yeah. And that was the other thing that was really interesting to see is that how, even though bobcat and wolves are far more efficient, the sheer number of fawns that are killed by the coyotes and the bear is
Yep,
you can barely compare the two. It's that
exactly.
stark of a difference.
Yep. And so if you just look at fawn survival in the first few months of life, right? So not looking at overwinter mortality or anything like that. If you just look at fawn survival in the first few months of life, pardon me, coyotes and bears account for over 20%, about 21% of fawn mortality is just coyotes and bears. Wolves are about 3.5%, bobcats are 5.5%. So that just gives you another way to reference that information.
Okay.
And that's just in the first few months, right? So,
Right. You kind of already answered. I was gonna ask if that kind of like when they make it to a certain point in their life, if that kind of transitions where the bears and coyotes are less, you know, uh, effective at getting the fawns, and then maybe the bobcat and the wolves, is that when they're more, um, is that when the, I figure out how I'm gonna say this right? As they get older, is it harder for the bears and coyotes to affect those fawns, or is it still, that first, pretty much that first summer, they're
so the reason we looked at the data that way is because that's when the highest mortality of fawns occurs is in the first few months of life, right? Because they're dying from their abandonment issues and natural causes of mortality and disease, and so their highest vehicle collisions, their highest um, period in life of mortality is in those first few months. And so that's why we looked at that then, right? I mean,
gotcha.
bears really are only going after deer when they are fawns for the most part, right? So yeah, bear mortality would certainly drop off, but that's when that highest window of mortality is in those first few months for fawns.
Gotcha. Yeah, so that's kind of that critical, those
Yep.
first few months are the critical ones. Once you kind of make it past that, then your likelihood
Yep.
is probably much better, huh?
Yeah, because if you look at survival of adult deer, it's considerably higher, right? It's about 80%, and that's in a system with a lot of snow, right?
Gotcha. Yeah, because that was the next thing that the report kind of talked about was the adult doe mortality, and um, really only, at least for the predators wise, the only one that I remember reading through was the wolves. That was really the only data that was really mentioned in that regard. So the bears and coyotes probably, and probably even the bobcat, is it so low in a number that it's not really, worth tracking, or it's not significant enough maybe?
It's definitely a lot lower. So when you're looking at adult doe mortality, and the reason we didn't look at buck mortality, in case anybody's wondering, is because bucks, of course, are a heavy target during hunting season, right? So looking at their mortality is kind of a waste of time. It's a completely different picture because they're the prime target during hunting season.
Sure.
So the big message for adult doe mortality to keep in mind is that 80% of those deer that live, or 80% of those deer live. And so if you then look at the sources of mortality of the 20% that die, right? So if the 20% that die, the largest source of predation is definitely due to wolves. It's about 8.5. I'm looking at the number here. About 8.5% of that 20% of does that die is due to wolves, and then the other three predators combined account for about 3.5%. So wolves are more of a factor on those adult deer than the other three predators combined. Yep. Yeah. And not that, and still, you're still talking about 20% predation. So, I'm sorry, 20% mortality, right? So there are other sources of mortality in there as well.
Yep. Yeah, because I think the other ones were still considered vehicle collisions, and I think just the winter
natural
kill.
sources of mortality.
Yes.
Yep, exactly. Winter kill is considered one of the natural sources of mortality as well.
Sure. Because even because what the data you're working with was a group of collared deer that were monitored, and you use that as what the for the baseline for the data. And I broke down even for the number of deer that survived and for the mortality rate of those deer, even the wolves. If you count all the deer that were in the study, they counted for I think just over 1.5% of the total population that they affected. Because I know that 8%, you're like, well, see, they're still killing lots of does. But if you look at even that smaller database of those collared deer, if I did my math right, it was only 1% or 1.5% of the population that those wolves would have, killed the whole study group.
Yeah, and I did not do the math that way to look at it that way. But yeah, you're right. The sample population was just over 400 radio-collared does that they looked at. So it wasn't like we're basing it on 14 deer. You know what I mean? It's a pretty good sample size over quite a lot of years.
Yeah, the one thing I was interested in too is because in part of that data, it said that 43% of those does that were killed by wolves were more likely would not have made it through winter anyways. I'm curious how is that determined that, or how is that determination made, I guess?
Yeah, that's something that didn't get into the report, but was something that we spent more time on when we've given this talk in person. And so,
okay.
Yeah, so it's a good question. It was hard to decide how much of everything should go into the report. It's already a pretty substantial read for a lot of folks, right? So
yeah.
So the first thing to look at there, and what you're referencing, is that the timing of those wolf kills on adult deer. Most of those, almost 70% of those, happened in March, April, and May. So deer have already gone through the bulk of winter. They've used up lots of body resources. They're already, when you're talking about March and April, those deer are in poor physical shape, period. They're in bad shape. And so if the bulk of those deer, the bulk of those does that wolves are killing are already in bad shape, 70% of those. And then when we looked at bone marrow fat is what you look at. So bone marrow, the fat in bone marrow is the last fat that a deer's body uses before it's all gone. So everything else is already all gone. All other fat is gone. All you have left is the fat that's in your bone marrow. And so we can look at a fat index in that bone marrow. And so if you think about buying a steak with a bone in it at the grocery store, it's that solid white fat in the bone, right? That's usually like 100% fat because it's nice and solid and white. Well, over the course of the winter, that fat changes color and consistency. So it'll start to be a little more spongy. It'll start to have some red flecks in it, which all of this means the fat is being reduced from the bone marrow. It will end up turning into red liquid. And so before it's even full on red liquid, that deer is beyond the ability to recover. So even if, that deer is basically walking dead, right? So it's not uncommon for biologists in the UP to check the bone marrow fat of deer when they're starting to migrate back, when we feel like, ooh, winter's almost over here, let's see what kind of shape these deer are in. So ones that get hit by cars, we'll check that bone marrow fat, and if it's like that red Kool-Aid, That deer was spending its last energy migrating, and more than likely it's either going to die on the way, which of course in this case it did. It was hit by a car. It would
Sure.
die of starvation on the way, or it would die when it got there, right? So what you were referencing is of those deer that were killed by wolves, of that whole sample, almost half of them were deer that already weren't going to make it. When that bone marrow fat index reaches a certain point, the deer's done. It doesn't. Yes, it died from something, but the deer wouldn't have made it anyway. So 43% of them, almost half of them, were already at that stage. And there were arguably another chunk of them that were right on the doorstep of that stage, right? So they, if winter had persisted, they might not have made it either. So
Gotcha. Yeah, so when I read it, I'm like, well, how are you gonna tell? Like, if you come across a deer carcass that's been eaten by wolves, like there can't be much left to be able to go off of. So they just try to look at or find a bone that maybe still is intact, and then be able to pull the marrow from that or look at that sample there.
yep, and
Because I was
that's
like,
why that sample size is a little bit smaller, because not every kill has a piece of bone left that you can do that analysis on. Yep.
sure. Yeah, I was curious about. I was like, well, how do they know? Like, I'm sure there's not much left in many cases of be able to look at,
Yeah.
be like, I don't know if that deer would have survived or not. But it's really interesting that they use such a uh, use that bone marrow as the marker.
Yep. And wolves, you're right. Wolves do eat their carcasses, bones and all, right? So when people see a carcass in the woods and they see an intact deer carcass and the meat's all gone, the hide's gone, but the bones are all intact, definitely not a wolf kill, because wolves are going to eat those bones,
Okay.
Just
So
another unrelated tidbit, but certainly
if it's
topic
something like
related.
that, is there kind of an easy way to, guesstimate that was probably some other large predator, or it could have been just scavengers too that came across a dead deer if the bones are still mostly intact?
It could have been all kinds of things, but if wolves had come across that, they would have eaten the bones.
They would have tore it
So,
apart. Okay, interesting.
coyotes, if you see chewed on bones, coyotes chew on bones, but they don't break them and eat them the way wolves do. I was just going to say all kinds of other things could have happened to that deer, right? It doesn't mean that we can say one thing or another. We can just say it wasn't wolves, because they would have eaten it.
Yeah. Yeah, I was gonna say the only thing I've really noticed is like with coyotes, like they might like take certain parts of the deer like to other areas, but they usually don't go far, and it's usually still relatively still intact. So yeah,
Yeah,
that's interesting
exactly.
observation. Covers all the big topics. I guess the other thing is I guess I've kind of thought maybe this report was kind of talking about this the deer numbers in general, but it seems like that's not necessarily the case, that you're just kind of looking at the buck harvest. But you know, a lot of people talk about the deer numbers in UP, that, a lot of the talk is that the deer numbers are low or there's not any deer up in the UP anymore. So, I mean, based on your experience, I mean, what is the outlook of the deer herd in the UP?
Yeah, I mean, people are not wrong in that deer numbers have declined and declined and declined. In particular, well, I mean, across the UP, and in particular in the last, well, since 90, the mid 90s. So what is that? Almost, well, I don't know, it's more than 20 years, right? So, but it's so linked to the number of severe winters we've had, right? And so, I mean, if we were able to get, gosh, even two mild winters back to back would make an impact in the deer population. We would start to recover some of those numbers. Honestly, I mean, if we had a big a long pulse of consecutive mild or moderate winters, anything that was not a severe winter, we would see deer numbers increasing again. We just haven't had that. I've been in this office for 20 years, and only once have there been 3 mild winters in a row. And I don't think there's ever been, maybe there was one other time with a mild and a moderate winter in consecutive years. But other than that, it hasn't happened. And it just really, you just can't you just can't grow your population back when you're continually losing your previous year's fawn crop.
Gotcha. So I guess with that, I mean, are there programs that the DNR is currently doing, or Is there an action plan to try to help that deer population out to try to get more of those, especially like you said, those fawns through the wintertime?
Um, Nothing. I mean, the best thing to do would be to not have bad winters, right? And of course, we can't affect that at all. So, I mean, there are some programs out there that can help improve summer habitat, but of course, that's not really the major limiting period for deer, right? The limiting
Right.
period for deer is winter. And so, there are supplemental feeding programs where the public can supplementally feed deer. That's always a bit risky because anytime you supplementally feed anything, even birds at your bird feeder, which I'm guilty of, anytime you supplementally feed anything, you are increasing the risk of disease spread. And the diseases that we're talking about spreading could include tuberculosis or chronic wasting disease, neither of which we want to have all over the Upper Peninsula, right? And the other thing with supplemental feeding as a way to support deer in winter is a lot of the foods that people want to feed aren't, it's like if humans existed on potato chips all year, right? So you can stay alive for a long time probably if you just ate potato chips, but it's not doing your body any good, and it's not always going to be enough, right? So
Gotcha.
so there are individuals in the past. There have been some substantial supplemental feeding programs around here, and in the past there have been situations where, and that's why I've seen this during my graduate field work, and I've heard about it from lots and lots of other people, where they're supplementally feeding deer. They're feeding them all winter long. There's more food than those deer can eat every single day, which isn't really supplemental anymore, right? And they'll go out to put more food out, and there will be fawns curled up dead right there in the middle of the feed. So there comes a point when it's insufficient. It's not enough, right? They just can't handle winter conditions for that period of time.
Okay. Yeah, I guess because I mean, I do a lot of like, my own habitat work and stuff like that. Some of my hunting properties and whatnot. Like, and we already talked about how the cedar and hemlock,
Mm-hmm.
is not
Yeah.
what it used to be. I would think, hey, maybe if there was something that we could do to promote, more hemlock
Mm-hmm.
forests and more cedars, that's going to help them during that winter time. So I don't know what that program could look like. But I would think that that
Yeah.
could be a solution
I mean,
for
that's probably
benefit.
one of the biggest things there, right? Is if people can do everything they can to protect cedar and hemlock in deer winter yards is a huge factor, right? And um, if they could plant mesic conifers, right? So cedar and hemlock and white pine, if they could plant those in places where they could become established, then those spots could be cover for deer as well in winter, right? And those things could help as well. So every little bit of that people do, because there is private land in deer wintering complexes, and some of those folks probably don't like having as many deer as they have on their property, and there are probably others that want to do everything they can to benefit the deer in those places. So conserving those cedar and hemlock is hugely important to future deer populations, and trying to
Gotcha.
increase it wherever they can.
Gotcha. And then you were saying that it's been such a long time since the aspen has been harvested. I mean, is there, you know, up and coming going to be a significant number of aspen harvests coming up that could start that regeneration for the summer habitat?
So in the state forest system, there's a desire to not have decreasing aspen harvests, right? So that's basically saying we're trying to maintain a level of aspen harvest. Private landowners can do the same sort of thing, right? They can, one of the things that you do that benefits deer in winter is to provide natural forage, right? So if people are, again, in a deer yard, live in a deer yard, or own property in a deer yard, if they're planning on doing any harvesting, if that harvesting occurred during winter, then it benefits deer because it's natural food that they can eat, and their body's already planning on eating or hoping to eat, right? Those buds that they can browse are highly beneficial to deer. So that's another way that people can really help out, is if you're in a deer yard or adjacent to a deer yard, right?
Gotcha. Yeah, because it kind of seems to be a growing trend of, that the much of the area, not even just in the state, but and then even regards to other types of wildlife, that a lot of different animals are dealing with degraded habitat, and there's a growing push for improving habitat. If it's cover, food, or different water sources even.
Yep.
They're talking about that with like the quail, the sage grouse, the turkeys,
Yep.
and of course white-tailed deer and whatnot. So
yeah, anything that helps animals put fat on for winter with pretty much any animal is going to be a benefit, right? So a lot of people like to plant acorns or mast producing crops, and because that mast is available in the fall, and that's really great for animals going into winter as well. It really helps them put on fat.
right, yep. And again, I mean, anyone that knows the draw that a food plot can have or something like that in a hunting situation, and depending on what you plant, I mean, they'll be digging through that all winter long too. So
Yep.
All right. So is there anything else from the report or anything else from this conversation that you think we needed to touch on, or that we might have missed, or want to reiterate another point?
I can't really think of anything off the top of my head. I guess I would just encourage folks to, if they to pay attention to winter, because it really, all of these things interact together, right? But winter seems to clearly be the driving force, right? And unfortunately, it's the thing that we can do nothing about, right?
Sure. Yeah.
But anything that we do to maintain winter habitat and help animals put fat on in the fall, so they go into winter in better shape and can withstand winter a little bit longer, those kinds of things will help deer, especially when the main driving force is something that we can't control at all.
Gotcha. All right. Well, again, thank you for coming on and going back through this report, and going in a little bit deeper with some of the data that even the report didn't show. Again, it was just kind of one of those things where I was interested in the dynamics of the deer population up in the UP, especially because of conversation with, primarily the wolf population. That's got a lot of people very nervous. So I was just kind of doing a little bit of research and stumbling on your report, and I thought had a lot of good information, especially because it talks about, how winter affects the deer or how winters affect it, how the habitat is affected, not just the predators. So it's not not as straightforward as you think.
Right, and I think if folks go into reading the report with an open mind, they're really going to see that wolves are not they're not making the biggest impact on deer of all those four predators at all. And so folks really want to take on, deer predators and have more of an impact, then wolves really should probably not be their target. They're not the main species out there having the biggest impact, which I think is, I'm not being foolish here. Obviously, that's not what a lot of people want to hear. It's not what a lot of people are going to believe, but it is what the data shows.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, certainly, yeah, you always hear the horror stories of wolves in certain areas, and then, yeah, sometimes you got to kind of bring it back and look at the actual data, like you said, and realize that if you want to save fawns, targeting wolves is not the way to go about it. It'd be, like you said, bears, coyotes, and working on the habitat to help them get through winter.
Yep.
All right. Well, again, thank you. I'll let you go for the day, and yeah, I think we'll wrap this one up.
Sure. Sounds good. Thanks for having me. If any of your listeners or folks watching the recording want a copy of the report, feel free to put my email there and we can get it out to folks.
Yep, we can do that, or even I will link the PDF to the report itself right in the show descriptions. Make it real easy for them. So yeah, I highly encourage that if anyone's interested, read through the report yourself, look at the data, look at the graphs, especially because they are very telling when you got those figures in front of you, and it's right there in that illustration for you to look at. So,
Yep, sounds good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks again. Take care.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye. All right, so that is a wrap with the conversation with Kristie. Again, a lot of really good information from her, so I do appreciate her coming on and diving into the subject and explaining some of the data and some of the points on this report as well. Again, if you want to read the report yourself and take a look at some of those graphs, especially, the link will be down in the show notes, so you can check that out, read through it for yourself. Kind of what I've gotten out of it, at least especially talking to her, that really the big deciding factor on the deer population and ultimately what that report is really all about is the buck harvest, that winter is your deciding factor in regards to all that. And then as we kind of closed out, as you heard, that we talk about some of the things that we can do to help the deer population out. So especially if you are a whitetail fanatic like I am, there are things that we can do to help the deer herd out, help help the population out, and help, sustain a healthy deer population. So with that, we're going to end it here. And as always, get out there, be safe, and have fun.